Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Today we look at this unusual and very interesting sword. I think it's interesting not only in and of itself as an object, but also because it can help us dive into a time and place in history which many of us may not be too familiar with. I certainly wasn't, and I found discovering a new part of history and details of historical events really exciting, and I hope you do too. Some of you may have already recognized this as the typical Briquet hilt. The Briquet was a French sidearm which came to prominence in the early 19th century and was eventually adopted by armies all across Europe. And not only. And I think that "and not only" is key to today's video. Some careful observers among you might also have noticed that the blade is not your typical Briquet blade. It's broader and it has this thicker bulge towards the tip, which you normally don't see. But we'll look at that into detail in just a moment. So it is kind of a Franken sword or a bit of a composite. But in this case, it's being a composite, it's not being completely factory made. Actually, I think lends to its historicity rather than detract from it. And the reason I say that, I think the key to understanding this is in the only mark we can see on the blade. And it's Nueva Granada, 1845. So, what is Nueva Granada and why is it relevant? The Republica de Nueva Granada was a republic which comprised areas between the Isthmus of Panama and the north of South America. So we're talking about areas mainly in today's Colombia, but as far as parts of Brazil. It was instituted as a republic in 1832 and eventually was disappeared or ceased to exist in 1858. In these 36 years of existence, this country was characterized by a lot of events, a lot of reform, a lot of turmoil, and a lot of conflict. So it is not unsurprising to me that a small or new state with very uncertain politics and constant conflict may have been creating weapons out of whatever they could find. And my feeling here is that this is an older blade that was quickly hilted onto a Briquet saber to make it into a functional weapon for use in modern in the time when it was created, so 1845. A few quick points about the history of Nueva Granada. I did mention there was a lot of conflict, and that is definitely the case. The first big conflict comes in 1838. It's called the War of the Supremes. It's started off as a small rebellion due to the closing of monasteries. This was part of the initial reforms. And the conservative or religious population of one of the regions rebelled. While the rebellion was quickly quashed, a bunch of warlords or local powerful men local to different regions of the state decided to take advantage of the instability of the country to rebel against the government. They called themselves Jefes Supremos, so like supreme chiefs. So that is why the war became known as War of the Supremes. The war ended in the early 1840s. And after that came a constitutional reform. And you can see that this is a cycle that repeats very often in the short life of this republic. You have reform and then conflict, reform and conflict. And some of these reforms were also quite modern and far-seeing. So for example, they abolished slavery. They instituted universal suffrage, although only for males and only over 21 years old, for instance. They decreed the separation of the state and church. They expelled Jesuits. So you have a lot of these very radical liberal reforms, which often were met with resistance. One of these civil wars actually happened in 1845. This was the last of the civil wars, which to me kind of makes me think that this date and this mark is really relevant. So after this last civil war, the country went through a bunch of reforms that were finally passed, and eventually the country moved from its centralized organization to a confederation. It became the Confederation of Colombia, and that then became the United States of Colombia. So tough and conflict-filled history, but a kind of gradual phasing out for this state. With all the historical details out of the way, let's take a look at the sword in detail. Okay, so let's dive into the details of this blade. As I mentioned, it has a fairly standard Briquet hilt. You'll see it has the usual ribs here, and you can also see it's quite scuffed and marked. It's definitely been through some abuse. I'm not necessarily saying that was combat related, but it's not straight out of the factory. You can definitely see some marks. It has no markings on it that I can see, except for this here, which might be a remain of some mark. I'm not 100% sure, I can't say for sure, but you can see here, these marks seem to be a little different from the others, and they could be a remain of some writing that I am not able to decipher though, which has been ground off or removed. Moving forward, we have this round quillin. Briquet sabres sometimes have different forms of quillins, but this one is the one this one has. And we can move to the blade, but not before I show you how this sword was kind of Frankenstein together, because since the blade was too thin to fit in the slot in the hilt, they shimmed it first with a piece of metal. You can see there's a metal bar that's about as wide as the tang, and then they nailed, literally, they drove a nail in there, and that created so much pressure, I think, that it actually cracked the hilt here. So you'll see a beginning of a crack. And they might have used more than one nail too, because when I move the hilt around, let me see if that works. Yeah. You can perhaps hear some metal moving occasionally. Yeah, there you go. So something is stuck in there, or something got loose, more precisely. Now moving on to the blade. Well, the first thing I want to show you is the mark. It's Nueva Granada, 1845. So this is very interesting because it's a mark I've never seen, and I don't know if I'll ever see one again. I can't imagine these being super common. Even in some of the conflicts I mentioned, for example, in the Civil War of 1845, even through a battle for Bogota, which was the capital of Nueva Granada, there was a siege, a battle, and that led to, I think, 2,000 casualties. So we're obviously not talking about massive armies on a Napoleonic scale here. So I can't imagine that these weapons were created in the millions. Now moving on to the blade. I can't say much about the blade itself. You'll see it has these 3 deep fullers on each side, which are rather irregular too. They're not precisely machined. You can see here how they end in weird, they don't even end at the same point. And they're not even as long on both sides. So you'll see the ones on this side are way shorter. And there's no other mark. So either if there was any mark or engravings on this blade, they were ground off, which wouldn't surprise me. You can see quite a few, let me see if I can get them in focus, but you can see quite a few marks on this sword. But it would also not surprise me if there were no engravings or marks even previously. What I do know though, well, before we go there, let's move to the tip. You'll also see here the tip of the blade bulges, so it becomes thicker, almost like your stereotypical pirate sword, I would say. The length is in line with Briquet length blades, but I have the feeling that it was cut down at the bottom here, because as you can see, the fullers almost go right into what is now the tang, and perhaps they even go further down, I'm not 100% sure. So my impression is that this blade was shortened down at the end side of it to make it more into a more wieldable briquet style weapon. Now to the style of blade. If you look at a lot of older blades, you'll see that this three-fuller configuration, three fullers towards the top of the blade, are actually quite common in older weapons. So not 19th century, but we're talking about weapons from the 18th century, even early 1700s perhaps. You can see these in some sabres, early sabres, but you can also see them in, for example, some early versions of British cutlass models. You can also often see this kind of configuration in typical swords, recomposite swords, so swords that used traditionally older blades to be applied to a newer hilt. That is the case, for example, of the Moroccan nimcha. So if you look at some of the nimchas that you will find on auctions or for sale or online in pictures, many of them have this kind of curved blade, though not always this broad, and this configuration of three fullers. And in many cases, you actually even see the same kind of design where the top fuller ends a little bit sooner than before the other two. So with all this being said, this is all I can really say about this sword. I can't in any way conclusively say that this is an older, perhaps 18th century blade or early 18th century blade, but with all the information I have, I would say this is definitely a strong possibility. So, I hope you enjoyed learning about this sword as much as I did. This is the first South American sword I come across, but this interesting and unknown to me history definitely got my curiosity going to maybe dive into South American swords a little further. Not only swords, history too. So with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video as much as I did making it. There's going to be a whole bunch coming out soon, and I'll see you soon with another sword video. Thank you for watching.